Hello and welcome to the Risen Jesus podcast with Dr. Mike Licona. Dr. Licona is Associate Professor in Theology at Houston Baptist University, and he is a frequent speaker on university campuses, churches, conferences, and has appeared on dozens of radio and television programs. Mike is the president of Risen Jesus, a 501c3 nonprofit organization. My name is Kurt Jarris, your host. Welcome to the second season of the Risen Jesus podcast, and in the first season we had the opportunity to learn about Mike and his work, his mission and purpose for the ministry that he's doing. In the second season, we're going to be looking at the depth of New Testament scholarship. Well, we're introducing you at least to it, and we will be looking at an issue within New Testament criticism called the synoptic problem, sometimes referred to as the synoptic puzzle, but the synoptic problem. And this explores the relationship between Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Mike, I'll go ahead and let you take it away.
Oh, well, thanks, Kurt. Yeah, this is fun. Well, the synoptic problem, synoptic puzzle is a very interesting discussion. I think a lot of viewers are going to find this, listeners are going to find this an interesting season. When we read the Gospels, many view the four Gospels as being entirely independent, that they were simply writing their own accounts. But when we read the four Gospels, many of the stories are repeated. I mean, we would expect that, of course, if we're looking at four different independent accounts. We could say, well, why four? Wouldn't it be better just to have one containing all of them together? Well, a lot of people thought about this. The first person we know of which we're aware who thought about this, was a guy named Tatian in the latter part of the 2nd century, and he wrote what was called the Diatessaron. He took the four Gospels, and out of that he made one Gospel. That was around the year 180. And then, there are harmonies of the Gospels that we have today. His was the first harmony of the Gospel, and then you've got several of them today. You can just look on Amazon or Christian Book Distributor, any of these, and find harmonies of the Gospels where they try to make one. And, you can explain the different accounts and the differences in them by saying, okay, we've got four independent authors, but they are reporting about Jesus from different angles, and that's why they differ on some things. It's always given about if you have four witnesses looking at a car accident, they're looking at four different angles. They're going to describe it differently, and that's why the Gospels differ in some ways. And that is true to an extent, all right, but that's not the full story. So when we talk about the synoptic problem, all right, the first thing we look at, what does the word synoptic mean? And it comes from two Greek words. The one first is sun, meaning with or together. And then you've got opsis, which means a sight, viewing. So synopsis means to view together, to see together. And the reason they say that is you've got a book. It's called The Synopsis of the Four Gospels, put out by Kurt Aland. And what it does is it takes the stories. Let's say the feeding of the 5,000, which appears in all four Gospels. The story is set in four separate columns, one for Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And then you can read the story as it progresses line by line, word for word. Well, when you look at Matthew, Mark, and Luke, in some of these stories that are in a synopsis of the four Gospels, you see that there are some verbal similarities, all right? But you're able to put them side by side. You're able to look at the way they report it differently, and you're able to look at the similarities.
Are you able to maybe give us just one example here of these similarities?
Look, I mentioned the feeding of the 5,000, right? So that would be one, and you can put them side by side, and you can see lots of verbal similarities. You can see some differences. What a synopsis of the four Gospels does is it allows you to see the differences, but even more importantly, it allows you to see the striking similarities. A harmony of the Gospels will downplay the difference between the accounts, while a synopsis will help a person, a reader, identify them.
And there are even differences in English translations, how translations, render Matthew, Mark, and Luke and their words in our modern language today.
Yeah. Now, We look at as you mentioned, these English translations. Of course, there are different objectives behind those translations. So you have what are called functional equivalent or your literal translations. They tried to reproduce it as literal translation as word for word as possible of what the original Greek or Hebrew says. And then you have what are called dynamic equivalents, and they are more interested in communicating the concepts. They want to maintain a word for word as much as possible, but at times you want readability here, and you want the concepts that are communicated. That's where the emphasis is rather than the words. That'd be like the New International Version, the New Living Translation. You have paraphrases, of course. You have optimal equivalents that are like hybrids between the literal and dynamic. That'd be like the Christian Standard Bible, okay? But when we take, say, literal translations like the New American Standard Bible and the English Standard Version, okay, so they're both functional equivalents, literal translations. We can see that they will translate the same verse pretty much the same, but there are differences. So, for example, in Mark 1:38, the New American Standard Bible reads, "Let us go somewhere else to the towns nearby, so that I may preach there also, for that is what I came for." When you read the same verse in the English Standard Version, it says, "Let us go on to the next towns, that I may preach there also, for that is why I came out." So you have two versions, English versions, with the same objective, and they translate it differently. And the reason being, of course, is anybody who's even remotely familiar with another language will know that grammar is different in different languages. If you were to translate German or French or Spanish into English, you're going to translate it one way on a particular day, but another way on a different day. It doesn't mean the translation is wrong or improved. It's just it's kind of an art to it. There's no one-for-one correlation when you're translating.
I know for me, a common example that's brought up in apologetic discussions of gospel differences is the signage on Jesus's cross, and how they don't all say the same thing. There's a relationship here between on the synoptics and this issue, and it also has this sort of apologetic value as well. What should we think when we see differences on the signage of Jesus as the King of the Jews on the cross?
Yeah. Well, like you were saying in Matthew, it says, "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews." When you read it in Mark, it just says, "the King of the Jews." Luke says, "This is the King of the Jews." And John says, "Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews." Now, you can't really, the only similar thing in that is the King of the Jews, right? So what does it say before that, or does it even say anything before it? You can't really harmonize this perfectly. What we get here is that the authors are reporting an essentially faithful representation of what occurred, an accurate gist of what occurred, of what was written on that plaque. So we don't expect that we're getting a precise wording. Now, maybe one of them has the precise wording, but we don't know. We don't know what the precise wording on that was.
So when some people want to get that precise wording, they're really taking a rigid lens approach to the Gospels instead of recognizing them in their genre, and that these minor differences were acceptable because, like you said, the purpose was for the gist or a reliable conveying of what happened.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, I mean, it's not like this was dictated. I mean, I used to think that. When I learned Greek, I remember reading Jesus's words in John to the man who was born blind, whom he had healed. And as they're talking back and forth, I'm thinking, wow, this is what it really, I'm reading it in Greek and said, this is what it really sounded like. And of course, I wasn't thinking that, well, Jesus probably, and this guy probably were Jews. They were probably speaking in Aramaic, not Greek. So that's not what it sounded like. And then I had no idea that, I mean, that one's only reported in John, I think. But when you read it, and when you read other things that Jesus said in the synoptics, and you read it, what he says differently, then you realize they are not reporting his precise words. They are recalling what he had said.
Could you give us a modern day example of what it might look like for a recollection of an event?
Yeah. So Kurt, let's just say you and I think I'm scheduled to come up there in May, and we're supposed to do something, and we're going to see each other then, I think, in October too. But let's say one of those events, you and I are having dinner, okay?
Okay.
And you're taking me to dinner in a really, really nice, expensive Chicago restaurant.
This is surely fantasy.
And as we're eating, there's a couple at the table next to us, a man and a woman, and they just start arguing, and it gets more intense, and it gets more intense, and they're arguing in Spanish, and then finally they stand up and they're screaming at each other, and she takes a glass, smacks it, and breaks it on the guy's face, and big gash opens up, and just then police come in, they handcuff the woman, and paramedics take care of the guy's wound on his cheek. And the cop comes over, one of the police officers comes over and says, hey, you guys were in the table right next to it. Can you describe what happened? And so they give us something to write on, and you and I began writing. And we hand it over to the police officer. Now, the police officer reads it. Now, if we were doing this entirely independently, without any collusion at all, or collaboration between the two of us, let's say, we're going to report the same event. A lot of the details are going to be similar, but we're not going to report it in the same words, right? And if the police officer looked and he's reading our two accounts and he sees that they are virtually word for word, then he knows that there was collaboration between the two of us. One of us was copying from the other, or we put this story together. We came up with it together and wrote it down that way. And what it would even seal the deal even more is if we heard it in Spanish, and let's say we're both fluent in Spanish, and we're recalling the event in English. And that translation was virtually word for word. That would seem to suggest that there's collaboration between us. They're not independent accounts. We might have seen it independently, and we might be agreeing on the details, but we either collaborated to come up with a single account or nearly single account, or, one of us was relying on the other as a source to copy from. And this is some of the kind of stuff we observe going on in the Gospels, which suggests that they are not writing. This is the synoptics, at least, Matthew, Mark, and Luke.
Yeah.
John is very different, so that he's even though he's included in a synopsis of the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke are so similar in many ways that we'll be discussing that they're called the synoptic Gospels. And so we see this, and we see there's some sort of a literary relationship between them.
Now, in the example you gave, I've got a number of maybe questions and remarks. So here you've got this hypothetical scenario where we're in a restaurant, an expensive, fancy restaurant, and we're both fluent in Spanish. So now this is certainly fantasy, since I am not.
Neither am I.
And so, but now, even then, so that's two of us looking at the events. With the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we're told, at least in Luke, and church tradition tells us that both of those were not eyewitness accounts,
right.
but were based upon eyewitness accounts from others. So Mark being based on Peter's teachings, and Luke in chapter 1 explicitly tells us that he is undertaking an investigation. So there might be some copying going on if Luke maybe has, very likely has Mark, or maybe even has Matthew. So but when Luke's saying he's doing this investigation, there's nothing wrong then per se with him copying some things from some of these Gospels, is there?
Oh, no. It was standard for ancient historians and biographers to use other sources. We know that Plutarch used Asinius Pollio, who was an eyewitness to much of the Civil War. He was the Roman Civil War. He was with Julius Caesar. He's a friend of Julius Caesar. Sallust, he was an eyewitness to some of the things with Caesar. But Plutarch's going to mention Asinius Pollio. You've got others who mention their sources. Suetonius is going to mention his sources. Like, for example, in his Life of Augustus, he mentions that he had access to letters that Augustus had personally written. So, yeah, there's all kinds of, they'll mention sources, and it was fine. It was standard for someone to sit down and use one source as their primary source and then to supplement it. So we're not to expect necessarily, like scholars and students do today, where you sit down and you've got a desk and you have all these books that are open and consulting these commentaries and other resources, word studies, lexicons, things like that. It wasn't that way. They would they didn't have a table and chair back then, you know. They were kind of sitting or reclining on the floor. They used servants, and you know, they would have one primary source. They would recall things from memory, but they usually use one primary source and then supplement that with other sources and have drafts and then a final. So, yeah.
All right. So with this example again here, what we have is this. We have what's the gist of the story, and if we were to give completely independent accounts, we wouldn't. We would expect there to be variation, and there is to some degree some variation, but at the same time, there are
plenty of variation, right?
Yeah, plenty of variation. But at times we do see word for word, and it's not just word for word of the original language that Jesus spoke, but it's word for word of Greek. And so this sort of sets off red flags in the sense that there is some relationship, some deeper relationship here, rather than independent, strictly exhaustively independent accounts.
Yeah. And when you say red flags, it would only send off red flags to if we have the view
right
that these guys sat down and wrote independently without knowledge or use of one another's work. Okay, that they wrote entirely independent. Well, then such observations as we've alluded to here, they're going to put up red flags to say, hey, that view may be problematic.
Right. Not that the Gospels themselves are problematic.
Correct.
Yeah.
It would be our view of the Gospels that could be problematic.
A fine distinction there. Yes. All right. We're going to be getting into observations in the text that suggests this sort of relationship exists in our next episode. But something, before we close out this episode, something we've done in the off season here is to solicit questions from our listeners, Mike. And we've had a couple people inquire about book recommendations. So Brandon here asks, what theology books would you recommend to people who aren't in seminary and just beginning to traverse the theological field? So your answer could include a must-read list of theologians / books to read.
Whoa, there are a lot of them. I don't focus a whole lot on theological matters. I do some, but I don't focus on a lot of them. But, some good theology books out there. There's one called New Testament Theology by I. Howard Marshall. Came out not long ago. It's an excellent book. A Theology of the New Testament by George Eldon Ladd. That's a really good one. You got The Story of Theology by Roger Olson. That's a really nice read. It's more of how church history. It's a very easy read. It's a thick book, so you'll be in it for a while. But it's a very thick book that just in a very clear manner just talks about how things were in early church and how things evolved in terms of the church hierarchical structure. First in the New Testament, we find that we have overseers, which would be like pastors and elders. And then you've come up later on, you got bishops, which would be like the chief church authority in a city. That's as you start to have several churches, local congregations within a city or a town, then a bishop would preside and have authority over the various overseers of each of those congregations. And then it talks about how the Catholic Church and how they were pushing for, or how the church was getting together and pushing for a pope, and how the first pope came about. They were trying to replicate how the Roman government was, they had an emperor, so there should be an ultimate authority over the church. And the church resisted that for a while and said, no, we don't want that. And finally, it did come around. And so it talks about all that for hundreds and hundreds of years of the church. And of course, theology is discussed in that in the various councils. So that's a good read.
Nice. For those that are, I'll add a follow-up here to Brandon. For those that are maybe exploring an academic route, is there an academic program for people to begin exploring theology or apologetics?
Oh, yeah, of course. Best one in the U.S., best one in the world at Houston Baptist University. Thanks for asking. I'm one of their professors there, and we've got what's called the School of Christian Thought, and there are various master's degrees that they can get. There's a philosophy department where you can get a Master of Arts in philosophy. You can get a Master of Arts in theology. In the theology department, you can get a Master of Arts in apologetics there, and a lot of these, maybe even all of them, I know you can in the MATS, the Master of Arts in Theological Studies, and you can in the Master of Arts in Apologetics. You can do the whole thing entirely online. It's fully accredited, regionally accredited, which is the highest accreditation you can get. So ours, of all the master's degrees in apologetics, ours is the most convenient. Ours offers the greatest amount of flexibility. And what I love about HBU is all of our faculty are evangelical, but there's a lot of diversity. So we have Catholics, we have Protestants, we have complementarians, egalitarians, Calvinists and Arminians. We have those who, like myself, who hold to the inerrancy of the Bible. We have others like Craig Evans who do not. They hold to the authority and the trustworthiness of and the divine inspiration of the Bible, but say that there are some errors in it. So the real nice thing about it is we all get along. We can have friendly discussions of disagreements, but we all get along, and it's really cool, Kurt. It's just a great program.
Great. Well, Mike, thank you for introducing us to the synoptic problem. I'm looking forward to learning more in this field as we explore the depths, just an iceberg tip of the depths of New Testament scholarship. Well, if you'd like to learn more about the work and ministry of Dr. Mike Licona, please visit risenjesus.com, where you can find authentic answers to genuine questions about the resurrection of Jesus and the historical reliability of the Gospels. There, you can check out free resources like ebooks, watch videos such as debates or lectures, or simply read some articles written by Mike. If this podcast has been a blessing to you, would you consider becoming one of our financial supporters? Please be sure to subscribe to this podcast and follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. This has been the Risen Jesus Podcast, a ministry of Dr. Mike Licona.